New meta update. So last week over in Japan, the two stellar decks released. Sylveon EX and I still don't know how you... Ceruledge EX. Those two decks released last week over in Japan, August 30th, and already they have been shaping up the meta quite a bit. Well, one of them has at the very least, and you may be thinking it's the Sylveon, given that its ability can shuffle two of your opponent's benched Pokemon back into the deck at the cost of 3 different energy types, but you would be completely wrong. Ceruledge is the one that's been seeing the most amount of play. While it's not a game-breaking deck, it is still pretty good for what it's able to do. So what does Ceruledge actually do? Ceruledge EX. Well, it is a 270 HP Fire Stellar Pokemon. Well, doesn't really matter, it just means it has an attack that's 3 different energy types. And it has 2 attacks. One of them costs a single fire energy, and it does 30 damage, but it also does an additional 20 more damage for every energy card in your discard. And then its second attack for a Fire, Psychic, and Steel energy does 280 damage, and then you discard all energy from this Pokemon. So 1 fire for 30 damage plus 20 more damage, and then a fire, psychic, and metal for 280, but then you discard all the energy. So why exactly is this deck seeing so much play given that the attacks are like, okay at the very least? Well, it's because Abyssal Flame can hit ridiculous amounts of damage. That's the name of its first attack. So looking at deck lists that have been coming up in Japan, you literally play Ceruledge as like your main attack Pokemon, plus a bunch of support Pokemon that basically draw and discard cards, along with a lot of energy. Most deck lists that I'm seeing here are playing minimum 15 fire energy, maximum like 20, 22. Because all this deck does is you get Ceruledge into play, maybe multiple, you give them a single fire energy, and then you just pretty much mill yourself. You pretty much just discard and draw, using Pokemon such as Squawkabilly EX, which can discard your hand if it's your first turn and draw you cards. You could use Radiant Greninja, discard a fire energy and draw 2. You can use Professor's Research to discard your whole hand. You can use Carmine to basically do the same thing, except you can do it on your first turn. There are plenty and plenty of cards that can just discard your cards. Ultra Ball, discard 2 cards and grab your Ceruledge or anything you may need. As well as the new A-Spec card that released in the deck as well, named Perfect Mixer, which lets you search your deck for 5 cards and just discard them. So you can search your deck for 5 energy cards and discard them, and that's 100 extra damage. So taking into account that the decks play like a minimum of 15 energy, that's 30 damage plus 20 for each energy. You obviously need an energy to attach onto the Ceruledge, so let's say you have about 10 in the discard. That's 10 times 20, that's 200 damage plus the 30, so 230. It's not a lot, but it's still like a decent amount of damage. But the ones that are playing 20 energy cards, let's say you have about 15 energy in the discard. So you do 15 times 20, that's 300 damage plus the 30. You can pretty much knock out anything. 330 damage, and all you need is 15 energy in the discard. Which means that if your Ceruledge gets knocked out, that's another energy in the discard, so you bring up another one and you're doing even more damage. Plus, it's a stage 1 Pokemon, so it's a lot easier to get into play. You don't need to play stuff like mid-stage evolution, you don't need to play Rare Candy, you just play the basic, Charcadet I think its name is, and then you play the Ceruledge, and then you play basically what you would normally play in like decks, you know, Earthen Vessel, Ultra Ball, Nest Ball, Buddy Buddy Poffin, Super Rod, maybe Rescue Stretcher, Trekking Shoes could be pretty good, Pal Pads so you could put supporters back. And then looking at lists, pretty much the only supporters that you play are Professor's Research, Carmine, Boss, and whatever else you want to tech in. Some decks are playing, some deck lists are playing Briar, so you can, you know, take an additional prize card if your opponent has so many remaining. Some have been playing Explorer's Guidance, the ancient supporter card that lets you look at the top 6, keep 2 and discard 4, I believe it is. Some lists are playing Iono. Some lists that I'm looking at are like a couple of cards, and then some lists are like the entire like decks. Like this one's playing Terrapagos and the Noctowl engine. It's also playing the other Ceruledge, which requires Psychic Energy, I guess because it requires Fire and Psychic for one of its attacks. Some have been playing Legacy Energy over the Perfect Mixer because they maybe want to make use of that second attack. The basis for this deck is literally just Ceruledge and Charcadet, Squawkabilly, Radiant Greninja, maybe Fezandipity for some draw cards, then your search cards, Nest Ball, Buddy Buddy Puffin, Ultra Ball, some recovery cards, you know, Rescue Stretcher, Super Rod, a couple of supporters, your spec, and then just a load of energy. Just a load of energy cards. The only kind of issue I can see with this deck is it could be kind of bricky, because this deck list here is playing 4 Charcadet, Squawkabilly, Fezandipity, and Radiant Greninja. That's only 7 basics out of a 460 card deck, and you're playing 20 energy cards, so you could have some instances where you're just drawing energy after energy after energy after energy with no way to discard them, or no supporter cards or anything like that. So I think the builds that are playing like other like techs in, like this one's playing Luminion, this one's playing, you know, Hoot Hoot and Noctowl, so you can actually, you know, search your deck for 2 trainer cards and actually get your engine going. This one's playing Curlier as a draw engine. There's one here that's for some reason playing Zamazenta V-Star. I actually don't know what that card does. But the main thing I want to talk about is, you know, obviously this deck is doing very, very good, but it's not the best deck because it does require a lot of setup in order to get going. Obviously you're only doing 20 extra damage for every energy. Keep in mind that's every energy in the discard. It doesn't have to be fire, so you could play it along with, you know, other Pokemon. You could play the Psychics and the Metal Energy, and those will add on the extra damage. Another thing to know is also basic energy, so any special energy doesn't count. Like, kind of issue with this deck is that it does require a lot of setup and it can be a bit bricky. Obviously 1 energy for however much damage you can hit is really, really good. However, you basically just need to churn through your deck as fast as possible, and playing such a large amount of energy, you're gonna have bricks and maybe a couple of mulligans here and there, which is going to give your opponent more cards. So it looks to be a very sort of, I wouldn't really say glass cannon type of deck. It just looks like a deck that takes too much setup, but it is doing well, you know, if you can get your engine going. Obviously you have Carmine, which you can use on your first turn if you draw it, and you have the new A-Spec Perfect Mixer, which can just discard any 5 cards, so you not only can discard energy, but you could also just discard away cards that you might not need anymore. So therefore you're decreasing the chances of drawing a brick and instead increasing the chances of drawing something that you may possibly need. It looks to be a very interesting aggro type of, you know, go through your deck as fast as possible, get this really big Pokemon into play that can hit for huge amounts of damage. Very reminds me a lot of Ancient Box, how you would churn through your deck as much as possible, draw cards, discard cards, and over time your Baby Roaring Moon would do more damage over time based on the amount of ancient cards in your discard. It reminds me a lot of that deck, but it can hit for a lot more damage, and it's also, you know, a lot more bulkier, I guess, and the attack costs less energy, and it has its benefits over something like Ancient Box, because it can actually play good supporters. It doesn't have to play all these, like, bad cards. And there's also a lot more engines in the game now that can make the deck really good. And if we get more cards in the future that let us, you know, discard cards, let us draw cards, let us, you know, search stuff, I imagine they'll get included into the deck. Plus, if we get any good new fire support, they could make their way into the deck. We'll just have to see how the deck evolves over time as more and more sets are released. But at the moment, it is doing pretty well over in Japan, but we'll have to see when it's released over here in the West, which will not be until Surging Sparks, our final set of the year. Although I don't think the deck will be affected much by next year's rotation. Looking at lists, you pretty much just lose, you know, a couple cards here and there, Trekking Shoes, Pokestop. You don't really lose any supporters, you don't lose any search cards, because they've all been reprinted and have the newest regulation mark and everything like that. So the deck doesn't really suffer from rotation. It will only get stronger as the years go on of its legality. But yeah, just a quick little video about this new deck popping up in the meta. Thought I'd give it some attention because I was just looking at, you know, news over in Japan and like tier lists and stuff like that, and I just saw Ceruledge there and I was like, that's interesting. I forgot that came out. Again, in my opinion, it seems a bit slow to get going, and it also seems a bit bricky, but I could be completely wrong. And who knows, it could see some decent amount of play. After all, it is a fire type, so it does counter some like tech options that some decks are playing. Regidrago and Raging Bolt. It counters Ogerpon because that's weak to fire, I believe. It can also counter some steel type decks if we get some in the future. Goldengo's doing well in Japan for some reason, and that card's weak to fire. Obviously, Teal Mask Ogerpon's weak to fire, so it does have its counters over some decks, but it also does have its weaknesses towards other decks. For example, Palkia V, which is going to start popping up more in the format after Stellar Crown becomes legal because of the new Area Zero Underdepth Stadium card. But it is a stage 1, and it does have a decent amount of HP at 270. So it can tank a few hits here and there, depending on the Pokemon, obviously. But yeah, I want to thank you all for watching this little video about Ceruledge EX. Let me know in the comments your thoughts about this deck. Will you be playing this deck when it comes out? Do you think this deck is going to be a problem? I personally don't think it will be. I imagine it'll, you know, pop up here and there, but it just seems like a bit of a slow deck to get going, and I imagine plenty of decks will have ways to counter that slowness to make it even, you know, more slow to get set up and everything like that. But the deck does look to be very strong. If it can get going, the more energy it gets in the discard, the higher numbers it'll be hitting, and eventually it'll just be able to one-hit KO anything and for 1 energy, which is also very, very strong. But make sure to like, comment and subscribe. There will be a Paradise Dragona set list review very soon. The set list just dropped. I'm literally going to do the video straight after I click end record on this one. Thank you all for watching, and I shall see you in the next video. Take care.